Chapter 27. By the next morning, I'd changed my mind. I wanted to see Anderson. I wanted to be able to tell him what I thought of him, his friends, and what they'd done. I waited until after Devin was gone for the morning, and I'd spent several hours thinking about it while I worked, before saying anything. I wanted to be sure I wouldn't change my mind again. Where are they holding him? Do you know? I asked Gavin as we ate sandwiches for lunch. He shook his head and swallowed his food. No, Devin didn't say. There's only a couple places secure enough to keep him. Ethan put in. I turned to look at him. I'd forgotten for a moment that he used to be Theron and would know things like where the cages that had been installed for holding a Kitsune are. I glanced at Gavin and found him scowling at Ethan, clearly unhappy. So, how about I call Devin and we head out there? I looked from one guard to the other, and back again. They both frowned at me, clearly not liking the idea. I don't know, Gavin said, laying his sandwich down. I waved one hand in the air. It's not like I'm talking about going without you, or without checking with Devin first. There's no reason not to. I quickly finished eating, then went in the bedroom to call Devin. Hey baby, how are things going? I asked as soon as he answered. Okay, but I'm kind of busy at the moment, babe. I know. I thought we might come out. I've decided I want to see him. He hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea. I noticed he didn't tell me flat out no. That was a good thing. I don't take no well. It will be fine, just tell me where you are and we'll come out. He sighed, knowing there was no way to stop me once I'd set my mind on something. We're at the ranch. All right, we'll be out there soon. Want me to bring you something to eat? No thanks, I'm fine. He paused. I guess I'll see you when you get here, but please don't go anywhere without the guys. I've got a bad feeling. No problem. I'll stay with them. I rang off and hurried to put on something suitable for going out. Working from home, I hadn't seen any reason to change out of my sweats this morning. Fully dressed and ready to go, I went back out to the guys. He says they're at the ranch. I turned to Ethan. I didn't know there were cages out there. There's an old root cellar. He nodded. We rebuilt it, lined it in concrete so it would be stable, and installed a couple cells. Are you really sure you want to do this, Nickie? Gavin looked worried. He's already gonna be in rough shape, and it's not like you know him anyway. I knew he was trying to look out for me, but I also knew I needed to do this. I know, I'm going anyway. I put on my coat and wound my scarf around my neck. You guys ready? I guess. Gavin took his coat and keys off the hook. Let's go. He opened the door and put his coat on as he walked out to the truck. Ethan locked the door and followed, climbing into the passenger side of the truck, leaving me in the middle. It was a seat I'd gotten used to. At the ranch, Ethan led us past the house to a pair of doors almost flat against the ground. Opening them, he motioned us inside. Gavin gave me an unhappy look, then headed down the steep steps. I followed, knowing Ethan would be right behind. At the bottom of the stairs, I looked around. It was a small room, maybe half the size of my bedroom, with a large cage on the far end, with a bare light bulb hanging lit in the middle of the room. But there was no one in the room. A closer look told me it was not one cell, but two. Still, they were empty. They must be in the barn. Ethan reached the bottom and looked around. Come on, I'll show you. He turned around and headed back up the way we'd come. I looked at Gavin, shrugged, and followed. Back outside, Ethan held the door open while Gavin and I climbed the stairs. Once we reached the top, he closed the door and led us around the house and out to the barn we'd projected the Super Bowl on. Moving around to the end, he opened a small door to one side of a much larger pair near the middle. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the dim interior of the barn, but once I did, I saw Devin near the center of the large empty building. He wasn't alone. There were a couple other men standing nearby, though I wasn't close enough to tell who with their backs to me, and another in a chair between them. I moved closer, slowly. I didn't want to disturb what they were doing. The man in the chair was blond, bulky, but I couldn't tell how tall he was. As I approached, I was able to see things more clearly. The man in the chair had to be Anderson. There wasn't anyone else who would be tied to a chair. I still didn't recognize the two with their backs to me, but I wasn't worried about them. If they weren't tied up like Anderson, then they were with Devin and not a threat to me. I stepped closer, watching Devin as he stood in front of the man, looking down at him. Beside me, something snapped. I looked and found that Gavin had stepped on a stick. It had broken, making the noise. I turned my head to see Devin headed toward me. "I don't like this," he said in a low voice as he reached me. "I don't like you being here, seeing this and being a part of this. I'd really wish you would let me deal with it." I stretched up and kissed him on the cheek. "I'm going to let you deal with him, but I need to see him to confront him." He closed his eyes and dropped his forehead against mine. "Come on." He took my hand and led me toward the center of the empty space. Might as well get this over with. As we passed the other two men in the room, I realized it was Brandon and Gabriel. I really should have recognized Gabriel. The closer we got to Anderson, the better I could see him. His head hung against his chest, but he looked up as I got close. One side of his face was swollen and purple, the eye would barely open. Anderson watched me with one wary brown eye. "Do you know who I am?" I looked directly at him. "Yes," he bit the word out, hard and angry. "Anything you want to say to me?" His gaze met mine for a minute before flicking to Devin for a second, then back. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." He looked away, avoiding my eye. "You were plenty angry at me when you killed Annie. Why don't you tell me about it? Or are you only man enough to speak your mind when you've got two friends helping you beat the shit out of a woman?" He looked at me, anger burning in his eyes. He didn't say a word, then looked away again. "Talk to me." The words flew out before I knew they were coming. All the eyes in the room shot to me. I felt the weight of them all, but I couldn't stop. "Tell me who I am?" "Nickie, the blood traitor." He spat the words out as if they were painful. Looking at his face, they may have been. "Blood traitor?" I lifted one brow at him. "You mated with that thing," he nodded in Devin's direction. "Instead of a good shifter like Brandon." His eyes flicked in Brandon's direction. I didn't think about it. I took 2 steps forward and slapped him across the face as hard as I could. His head whipped to the side and a loud crack echoed through the nearly empty room. Everyone froze, waiting to see what would happen next. I turned and looked at Brandon. His bruises had faded to a sickly yellow, and the cut over his left eye was gone. "How fast does he heal?" "Heal? What do you mean?" I rolled my eyes and looked back to Anderson sitting exactly as he'd been when I looked away. "Heal, you know," Devin said, "be behind me." "How fast?" "I don't know. Faster than me, but then almost everyone heals faster than I do." Brandon stammered. "Shit." Devin's voice wasn't happy. I kept my eyes on Anderson. After a moment, he shook his head, as if trying to clear his mind. He shook it again, harder. Obviously, whatever I'd broken, it wasn't his neck. "Call me what you will, but you don't insult my mate." He couldn't shift. One lip curled, making Anderson's disgust plain. "And neither could I until recently. You just didn't know." He tried and wasn't able. He made it sound just that simple. I wasn't sure there could be more disdain in someone's voice than there was in Anderson's in that moment. Shaking my head, I turned and made my way back to Devon. So, because I chose my true mate instead of someone you approved of, you killed another woman? Another Kitsune? I wrapped my arm around Devon's waist, indicating without words that I would stand by his side against anyone. That's not what I said. But that's what you did. Isn't it? The captive man hung his head, refusing to look at me. Looked like I'd hit a nerve. Good. I'd rather be with a good man, human, non-shifter, whatever, than an elitist murdering piece of scum like you. I spun on my heel and walked away. I felt people watching me, but I didn't care. I headed toward the door, not waiting for my guards. Throwing it open, I marched out, desperate to be away from him. I had only taken 3, maybe 4 steps out the door when something whistled past my face and slammed into the side of the building beside me. A body hit mine, knocking me to the ground and covering me as the crack of a rifle echoed in my ears. I lay sandwiched against the cold, hard dirt, a large body covering mine as several more shots were fired. I knew from the scent it was Gavin who'd knocked me down. There were people moving around, but I couldn't see anything because Gavin was doing his best to completely cover me. Are you hit? Devon asked through our connection. No. I'm fine, just a bit squished. Stay there until we're sure it's safe. It's Garza. It's gotta be. Gabriel's voice said. I waited as patiently as I could, wanting to know what was going on, but knowing I was safer where I was. Several more shots rang out. A wolf yelped. Distantly there was the sound of fighting and the snarl of wolves. Then nothing. Footsteps approached. Let her up, it's safe now. It was Devon. Garza's dead. Gavin rolled to the side, letting me have my first deep breath in several minutes. I sat up, took several breaths while I waited for my heart to slow. Devon held out one hand. Taking it, I let him pull me to my feet, where he immediately pulled me into his arms. Thank God you're safe, he breathed into my hair. I closed my eyes and held on to him. His natural smoky scent was mixed with blood, sweat, and vaguely tainted with the pungent odor of panic. Theron, Gabriel's voice called from a short ways away. We need you over here. Come on, let's go see. He held me against his side with one arm and headed in the other man's direction. My heart fell as we got closer, and I saw why they needed Devon. Brandon was laying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. There was a gaping wound on the right side of his chest, with bubbles forming in the blood that flowed freely. He gasped for breath, blood trickling from his mouth. Nickie. Every word he said was a struggle, but he tried to get up to find me. He seemed desperate. Is she okay? I fell to my knees beside him. I'm right here, I'm fine. The urgency drained from him and he relaxed, falling back against the dirt. Good. As long as you're not hurt, it was worth it. What's worth it? I looked around, desperate for something to press against the wound, to stop the bleeding. Gavin and I were the only ones left dressed. Without thinking about it, I peeled out of my coat, folded it, and pressed it against the wound, pressed hard. I had to stop the bleeding. Has anyone called Alexis? I looked up at the men, my eyes wild. Devon knelt behind me and wrapped his arms around me. Baby, it's no use. He pulled the jacket and my hands away, letting the blood flow freely from Brandon's wound once more. What? I scrambled to recover the wound. It was bleeding way too fast. Why? Baby, Devon's voice cracked. Alexis can't get here fast enough. He doesn't heal well enough, and that's not his only major wound. He calmly pulled my hands away again, wrapping his arms tight around me. He pinned my arms to my sides to keep me from trying again. I looked at Brandon's face. It's okay, he lifted one hand. I grabbed and held on. You're safe, that's what matters. He coughed hard. Blood sprayed, landing in flecks on us both. I knew he was dying. It made my chest ache. I did what I could. Kneeling on the ground beside him, I held his hand until his last breath left him and his body went limp. Someone found a blanket and covered most of him, leaving his face exposed. "Come on, baby." Devin pulled me away some time later. "His folks are here. Let them spend some time with him." In a daze, I stood and turned, burying my face against Devin's chest. He was dressed. Leaning back, I looked at him. The clothes were wrinkled and musty smelling. Someone must have gotten him the bag of things he kept behind the seat in the truck. I'd been so focused on Brandon. I hadn't known when he'd moved his arms. He didn't have to keep me from stopping the bleeding anymore, but I hadn't noticed people moving around or him dressing. I let him lead me away. Looking around, I noticed that there were more people here than before. Bill's SUV was parked next to Gavin's truck as well as Brandon's dad's car. There were several more people moving around as well. How had I missed this much activity? Devin led me to his truck and wrapped me in a blanket before lifting me up to sit on the tailgate. He stood between my knees, his hands cupped my face. "Look at me." I lifted my eyes to his face. He looked drawn, older than he had when he'd left the house this morning. "Are you okay?" I nodded, numb. His thumbs rubbed across my cheeks, drying them. Until that moment, I'd been unaware of the tears streaming down my face. He watched my face a moment longer, then pulled me against his chest and wrapped his arms around me. "No, I don't think you are." There were voices around us as different people would approach and speak to Devin, then the deep rumble of his voice as he answered, but I wasn't paying any attention. The words "Brandon is dead" kept running through my mind. I couldn't forget that he'd died protecting me. He'd been okay with it as long as I was safe. Brandon was dead. Dead. Sometime later, my face still buried against my mate, I became aware of what was being said. "What do you want done with Anderson?" Ethan asked. "We don't need him to find Garza anymore. There's no point in keeping him around," Devin said. I picked up my head. "Anderson's still alive?" "Why wouldn't he be?" Ethan asked. "I want to talk to him." I looked at Devin, my eyes pleading. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "I don't care, I want to talk to him." Devin stepped back and I slid off the tailgate, landing on my feet with a quiet thump. With new purpose, I strode toward the barn where I assumed Anderson was still being held. Inside the dim building, I didn't wait for my eyes to adjust before marching up and stopping in front of Anderson. "Have you heard?" He looked up, his eye full of contempt. "Heard what?" "Garza's dead. We don't need you anymore." I grinned. I knew it wasn't a friendly smile. Fear crept into his face. "That's not all." "Yeah, no, I'm next." I gave him a satisfied look. "Yeah, you are, but that's not what I was gonna say." "What then?" Knowing he was gonna die soon didn't sweeten his attitude. "Brandon's dead too." His eyes went wide. "How?" "He took a pair of bullets to save me and couldn't heal the damage fast enough. He bled out." "What? No way did Brandon die protecting a blood traitor." He sounded certain. "Sounds like you didn't know him as well as you thought." I didn't wait for an answer, I didn't want one. I went back outside. I'd rather stand in the cold than spend another minute with him. I stepped outside and squinted as the bright sunlight blinded me. "Nickie." Bill's voice startled me. I hadn't known he was there. "Yes, sir." "How are you doing?" I blinked several times, glad my eyes were adjusting, then looked toward where Brandon died. His father stood silent and grim-faced while his mother sat bent over his body, sobbing. I wondered what they would do. Would they be able to have a funeral? I looked at Bill. "I'm here." That was about all I could say at the moment. "You going to be able to handle this?" I looked at him a moment. Do I really have a choice? I waited a heartbeat. It may take me a little while to process it all, but I'll handle it. I looked away again. I wish it hadn't worked out this way. He shook his head. You've been through too much already. It's not like you had any control over it. Still, I should have been able to do more. I looked back to where Brandon lay. How are we going to deal with all this? What do you mean? He frowned. Is there any way we can set it up so his folks can bury him? I mean, have a funeral and everything? Bill blinked surprised. I'm not sure, let me see what I can do. He turned and ducked through the door I'd just come out. I took a breath. It was over. Troy West and Garza were dead. Anderson was the only threat left, and he would be dead soon too. My life would be my own. No more 24/7 guards, no more shadows. I could get up in the morning and drink my coffee in my underwear if I wanted. I'd been wanting this for a while, but now I knew I hadn't wanted it this badly. Not this way. A few minutes later, Devin came out. He stood behind me and wrapped his arms around my middle. What you thinking about? He whispered. Nothing. Everything. I gave a half-hearted shrug. The Aniquitos said you want Brandon to be able to have a funeral? Look at them. They loved him. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying to make up for what he'd done wrong. He died protecting me. My voice cracked. His arms tightened around me. I know, baby. I know. He held me for several minutes. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. After a while, I used my palms to wipe the tears from my face. I don't know why I'm crying. I spent months either angry at him or afraid of him. I should be glad he's not a threat anymore. He might not have been in your good graces, but he was once your friend, and you loved him for a long time. Losing every possibility that you could get even part of that back hurts. I just stood there without responding. I didn't want to move. I might lose his arms around me, and right this minute, that's all that was holding me together. I need to call Rain, see if there's some way we can set this up so it's official. So he can have a funeral? That was important to me. I'm not really sure why, but it was. Yeah, so he can have a funeral. He may have had his troubles, but he died with honor, and the least we can do is honor that. It won't hurt that we might manage to close one of Rain's missing persons cases too. I turned and buried my face in the crook of his neck. Thank you. He squeezed me against him a moment. I love you. Leaning back so I could see his face, I gave him the ghost of a smile. I love you too. Come on, there's no reason you need to stay here for this. Why don't you let Gavin take you home? You can run a hot bath. Get cleaned up and warm up after being in this wind all morning. I looked down at the blanket I still wore like a cloak. It didn't show much, but I knew underneath it my clothes were splashed and smeared with blood. My coat was beyond saving. I agreed to go clean up. Keeping the blanket pulled around my shoulders, I climbed in Gavin's truck and let him drive me home. We left Mickey at the ranch to help with the cleanup. At home, I took a hot shower, as hot as I could stand, and stood there several minutes letting the heat absorb into my skin while I watched the water run pink off my arms and hands. After scrubbing the blood from beneath my nails, I finished my shower and dressed in a clean pair of jeans and sweater, and went in the living room to wait for my mate to come home. It was almost dark when I woke to the sound of the back door opening. My heart raced and I wondered where Gavin was. Then it came back to me. He'd checked in with Devin a few hours after we'd gotten home, then he'd left. Sitting up, I waited for some sign of who had come in. There were no footsteps, only the soft whisper of stocking feet moving across the floor, but the stride made me almost certain it was Devin. Crap. It was getting late, and I hadn't even thought about dinner yet. You in here? Devon's voice called softly and he poked his head in the living room. A smile spread across his face. There you are. I ran one hand down my face, trying to remove the remnants of sleep from it and my brain. Yeah, I'm here. It sounded stupid, but I couldn't think of what else to say. He came in and dropped a soft kiss on the top of my head. How you doing? I looked up and gave him a sleepy smile. I fell asleep. That's a good thing. He moved around the sofa and sat beside me, pulling me into his arms. I wrapped my arms around him and laid my head against his chest. How'd it go? I called Rain. He came out and looked around, said if he got involved there would be a full investigation. It would be next to impossible to limit it to just Brandon or just Brandon and Anderson, and leave the rest of it out. Crime scene investigation is just too advanced. It would be a danger to the pack. So it can't be done. His parents can't have a funeral. I didn't say that. He ran one hand absently up and down my back. I picked up my head and looked at him. What? How? With one hand, he pushed my head back down against his chest. I was getting to that. His hand went back to making comforting movements up and down my back. Rain told me to call Hector Santos. Who's that? I'm getting there. You know, this would go a lot faster if you don't keep asking questions. Sorry. He chuckled. Anyway, Hector Santos is the sheriff of Cochise County. Why did Rain think this Hector could help when he couldn't? I couldn't contain my confusion. His body shook with laughter. Because he's the county sheriff, he can collect evidence he wants processed, then write up the report with what he wants in it, and unless questions are asked, no one will question it once he closes the case. Rain has a supervisor he has to answer to. Why would he do that for us, though? Apparently this Santos is Kitsune. What? I picked up my head again, this time to look at him in confusion. And we didn't already know this? Apparently not. It seemed like news to the Aniquitos when I talked to him about it. Is that why Rain told you to call him, because he's a shifter? I think so. What did he say, this Santos that is? He's gonna help us. He came out to the ranch, looked around and helped us set things up just right so he could take the pictures he needed for the file. What do you mean, set it up? What did you have to do? He looked everything over, said he didn't know what to do about the gunshot wounds, unless we had someone to pin it on. He paused. Well, there's not enough left of Garza for that, plus we'd have a hard time explaining the wounds from a wolf attack. So we told him about Anderson. By that time we had him back in the cage in the cellar. We explained how Anderson was going to die anyway, we might as well us it to our advantage. He looked things over and had us shoot Anderson, then give him Garza's weapon. The gun we used on Anderson was left with Brandon. It will be solved as two men got into an apparent disagreement of some kind and turned to guns. They shot each other. So Anderson's dead? I wanted to be sure. He's dead. Good. I was quiet a moment. But I thought the ranch is in Graham County, how will that work? Actually, the ranch is in both. I'm not sure where the county line is exactly, but Santos was careful to angle his pictures so there were no buildings or major landmarks. It will go into the report that it happened on the Cochise County side of the line. I sat for a moment, thinking about it all. It was done and Brandon's family could at least have some closure. They couldn't have him back like he'd wanted, but at least they had something. And what's gonna happen to Anderson's body? It will be released to his family. They've been making a stink about his disappearance, so at least that will stop. That will make Rain happy. We fell quiet and just enjoyed being together and alone. I don't know how long we sat, but the room darkened and the only light was the flickering of the fireplace. What was Brandon even doing there? I didn't look at Devon as I asked the question that had been running through my mind for the last several hours. He was helping me question Anderson. He wanted to be part of it, to help earn his way back into the pack. He knew the man better than any of us, so it made sense, at least at the time. He was right, it did make sense. Brandon would have had a better idea whether or not what Anderson was saying was the truth or not. Even if he was being honest and evaded tell us something, Brandon would have known better. Besides, Annie had been his friend too, and considering what he'd done to Jessup, I understood why he'd want to be there. I tipped my head back and kissed Devon's neck, but didn't say anything. Devon's stomach grumbled and growled, making me laugh. "When's the last time you ate?" I sat up and looked at him. "This morning." He gave me a rueful smile. "I've got nothing ready and nothing in the works. How about we order something and have it delivered?" "Sounds good, what do you want?" "I don't know, but delivery limits our options," I said. "To what? Chinese or pizza?" "And wings. The pizza place does wings too." We talked about food, decided what we wanted, and I called in the order. He chose a film to watch while we waited and ate. Later, after we'd eaten, I got up to get some household chores done. I cleaned up the kitchen and folded a couple loads of laundry. I turned my music up loud and I was dancing along as I worked. It was a relief to have the place to ourselves again, and I was enjoying it. In the laundry room, I danced in place, lost in the music while I folded the nearly overflowing basket that sat on top of the dryer. Lost in my own world, I didn't notice Devon slip into the room behind me. He took me by surprise when he slid his arms around my waist and danced along with me from behind. His familiar scent enveloped me and sent warmth through my senses. Everywhere he touched my skin sent bolts of heat straight to my core. I tipped my head back and let it rest against his chest. "You feel good, baby," I murmured. "It would feel better if you'd turn around and let me hold you right," he said against my ear. I turned in his arms and moved closer against him. We moved easily together in a rhythm we could only hear in our heads. The music around us swelled and raced, and we gently swayed in each other's arms, oblivious to anything but each other. He steered me out of the laundry room and through the kitchen, still dancing together, our bodies pressed together. In the living room, he picked up the remote and changed the music to something easier for us to dance to, at least the dancing we had in mind. I wrapped both arms around his neck and looked up into his eyes. "You know I love you, don't you?" "I do. I can feel it right here." He laid one hand over his heart. "Just like I feel it when you're hurting or upset. I've felt a lot of those last two lately and not nearly enough happiness from you, but I have a feeling it's gonna get better from here on out. Tonight you seem so light-hearted and happy." I smiled. "A lot has happened, but I feel like there's a weight off my shoulders tonight. I know the ones who tried to hurt me are no longer a threat. I'm safe and my family's safe. I'm standing in the arms of the man I love, what more could I ask for?" His eyes turned serious. "You asked me a while back to think about something. Do you remember?" I was quiet for a second. "Yeah, I asked if you want to try again." "I've been thinking about that. Actually, it's been on my mind a lot since you brought it up." "Have you made a decision?" He looked down, then met my gaze again. "Well, I don't really think it's my decision to make, but I've decided what I want." I held my breath. "I'm willing to try again if you are. I can't wait for a little copy of you running around." My heart skipped a beat, then leapt. I was so happy I couldn't speak for a moment. Instead, I stretched up and placed my lips against his, pouring my flood of emotion into that kiss. "I love you," I said a moment later, after we'd broken the kiss. "I love you too, baby, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." The end.